The crystal vase shattered against the marble floor, and 9-year-old Sophie Harrison stood in the center of the chaos, tears streaming down her face, while the 23rd nanny in 18 months grabbed her belongings and fled through the mansion's towering doors. But nobody knew that this little girl with golden blonde hair and a blue silk dress wasn't throwing tantrums because she was spoiled. She was screaming because nobody would listen to the pain buried deep inside her heart. Sophie's father, William Harrison, a tech billionaire worth over $3 billion, sat in his home office with his head in his hands, staring at his phone as another nanny agency told him they had no one else to send. His expensive suit wrinkled from another sleepless night, his eyes hollow from the weight of building an empire while watching his only daughter slip further away from him every single day. "She's impossible," the agency director said coldly. "We've sent our best, Mr. Harrison, but your daughter has bitten, screamed at, hidden from, and destroyed the belongings of every professional we've placed in your home. Perhaps it's time to consider a behavioral facility." And William felt his heart crack a little more, because he knew the truth. Sophie hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, his wife Grace had died suddenly from an undiagnosed heart condition, and in his grief, William had buried himself in work, throwing himself into mergers and acquisitions and international deals, telling himself he was securing Sophie's future, when really he was running from the unbearable pain of losing the love of his life. And in doing so, he'd abandoned the one person who needed him most. Sophie had started acting out 6 months after her mother's funeral, first with small things: refusing to eat, not sleeping, hiding in closets, but when nobody noticed, when her father kept missing dinners in bed, when nannies treated her like a problem to manage rather than a child to love. Her pain turned into rage, and the rage became the only language she knew how to speak. Meanwhile, across town, in a small diner, with cracked vinyl booths and a flickering neon sign that read Rosie's 25-year-old Rachel Morgan, tied her apron, tucked her light brown hair into a neat ponytail, and started her morning shift, smiling genuinely at every customer who walked through the door, despite the fact that she worked 2 jobs, lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling wallpaper, and was putting herself through night school to become a child psychologist because she believed every child deserved to be understood. Rachel had grown up in foster care, bouncing between 7 different homes before aging out of the system at 18, and she knew what it felt like to be invisible, to have adults look through you instead of at you, to scream for help in ways that nobody recognized, which was exactly why she'd decided to dedicate her life to helping children who couldn't help themselves. On this particular Tuesday morning, William Harrison made a decision born from desperation. He canceled his morning meetings, something he hadn't done in 2 years, got into his black luxury sedan, and drove Sophie into town to give himself a few hours to think, to figure out what to do next. But when Sophie refused to get out of the car outside the child psychologist's office, when she locked the doors and screamed until her face turned red, William's carefully constructed plan fell apart. Exhausted and defeated, he drove aimlessly until he found himself parking outside Rosie's Diner, a place so far removed from his usual 5-star restaurants that he almost left. But Sophie had finally stopped crying, and he was too tired to fight anymore. So he led his silent, tear-stained daughter inside, not knowing that this random decision would change everything. Rachel looked up from wiping down table 7 when the bell above the door chimed, and she saw something that made her heart squeeze. A well-dressed man in an expensive suit, looking completely lost, holding the hand of a small blonde girl in a beautiful blue dress and white sneakers, who stared at the floor like she wished she could disappear into it. "Sit anywhere you'd like," Rachel said warmly, and there was something in her voice, not pity, not judgment, just genuine kindness that made Sophie glance up for just a second, her blue eyes meeting Rachel's brown ones before quickly looking away. They sat in a corner booth, William immediately pulling out his phone, and Sophie slumped against the window, drawing invisible patterns on the glass with her finger, And when Rachel came over with menus and a smile, she noticed what nobody else had seen. Sophie's fingernails were bitten down to the quick. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she was humming a soft, sad tune under her breath. "Good morning," Rachel said gently, crouching down so she was at Sophie's eye level instead of towering above her. "My name's Rachel, and I want you to know that we make the best chocolate chip pancakes in the entire state. They're so good that I've seen grown adults cry happy tears over them. So I need to ask you a very serious question. Are you brave enough to try them?" It was a silly thing to say, but something about the way Rachel looked at her really looked at her, like she was a person worth seeing, made the corner of Sophie's mouth twitch almost imperceptibly. William ordered coffee and told Rachel to bring Sophie whatever she wanted, barely looking up from his phone. And Rachel felt a familiar ache in her chest because she'd seen this before. A parent physically present, but emotionally a million miles away, and she knew that ache intimately from her own childhood. Rachel brought out the pancakes herself, shaped like a smiley face with whipped cream and strawberries, and she sat down in the booth across from Sophie without asking permission. Something that made William finally look up in surprise. "I'm not supposed to bother customers," Rachel said with a conspiratorial whisper to Sophie, "but you look like someone who might need a friend right now, and I'm pretty good at being a friend. I'm not always good at math or keeping plants alive, but friendship, that's my superpower." Sophie stared at this strange waitress who talked to her like a real person, who didn't use that fake high-pitched voice adults always used with children, who didn't look at her like she was a problem to solve, and for the first time in months, Sophie spoke without screaming. "I don't have friends," she whispered, her voice so quiet Rachel had to lean in to hear it. "Nobody likes me because I'm bad." Rachel's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, but she kept her face calm and kind as she said, "You know what I think? I think you're not bad at Allie. Think you're hurting. And when people hurt on the inside, sometimes it comes out in ways that look like anger, but underneath, there's just a kid who needs someone to understand." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at her father. But William was back on his phone, typing furiously, completely missing this breakthrough moment, and Rachel saw the light dim in Sophie's eyes as quickly as it had appeared. Something inside Rachel made a decision that defied all logic. She took her break, sat with Sophie for 20 minutes, and just listened as Sophie talked in fragmented sentences about her mother, about how her dad never came home, about how the nannies all hated her, about how she broke things, because breaking things on the outside felt like what was happening on the inside. And Rachel held this little girl's hand across the table and validated every single feeling without trying to fix or change anything. When William finally noticed that his daughter was having a full conversation with the waitress, actually eating her pancakes and not throwing them, actually smiling, genuinely smiling for the first time in months, he was so shocked he set down his phone completely. "What did you do?" William asked Rachel when she brought the check, and there was no accusation in his voice, only bewildered wonder. "I just listened," Rachel said simply. "Children don't need to be controlled. Mr. Harrison, William Harrison," he said, and Rachel showed no recognition of his name or wealth, which was oddly refreshing. "And that's Sophie." "Sophie is wonderful," Rachel said, looking directly at the little girl. "She's smart and honest and braver than she knows." William did something he never did. He acted on impulse and he asked Rachel if she'd consider coming to work for him as Sophie's nanny, offering her more money than she'd make in 6 months at the diner. But Rachel shook her head. "I'm not a nanny, Mr. Harrison, and I don't think Sophie needs someone to manage her schedule or enforce rules. I think she needs someone to see her," Rachel said gently. "But I finish my shift at 2, and if Sophie ever wants a friend to talk to, she can come by the diner anytime." Over the next 3 weeks, William brought Sophie to Rosie's diner every Tuesday and Thursday, and what started as desperation became the highlight of Sophie's week. She'd sit with Rachel during her breaks, help wipe down tables, draw pictures on napkins, and slowly, like a flower opening to sunlight, Sophie began to bloom. Rachel never asked for money, never treated it like a job, just genuinely cared about this lonely little girl. And Sophie responded to the unconditional kindness like she'd been dying of thirst, and Rachel was offering water. But William, watching from the booth, began to realize something that made him deeply ashamed. He'd been so focused on providing for Sophie materially that he'd forgotten to provide what she actually needed: his presence, his time, his attention, his love. And this waitress making minimum wage was giving his daughter something his billions couldn't buy. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Sophie arrived at the diner quiet and withdrawn, not even responding to Rachel's greeting, and Rachel noticed Sophie was clutching a worn photograph. "Can I see?" Rachel asked softly, and Sophie slowly unfolded the picture. A beautiful woman with blonde hair, holding a laughing toddler Grace, and Sophie. "Today's her birthday," Sophie whispered. "My mom, she would have been 38. And Daddy didn't even remember. He was on a conference call all morning, and I miss her so much it feels like I can't breathe." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Sophie into a hug, letting this child cry into her shoulder, not shushing her or telling her it would be okay, just holding space for the grief that had been trapped inside for so long. William walked in at that moment, saw his daughter sobbing in Rachel's arms, and the sight broke something open inside him. He suddenly saw with painful clarity what he'd been doing, running from grief instead of walking through it with his daughter, hiring people to raise her instead of showing up himself, throwing money at a problem that required heart. "Sophie," William said, his voice cracking as he approached. And for the first time in 2 years, he got down on his knees in front of his daughter, not caring that his expensive suit was getting wet from the rain tracked across the diner floor. "I am so sorry. Your mom would have been 38 today, and I didn't forget. Sweetheart, I've been thinking about her all day, but I didn't know how to talk about it because it hurts so much, and I thought if I just kept working, kept moving, the pain would go away. But all I did was leave you alone with your pain. And that was wrong, so wrong, and I am so sorry." Sophie stared at her father, this man who never cried, who never knelt, who never apologized. And she saw tears running down his face, real and unguarded, and she whispered, "I thought you didn't care. I thought you forgot about her. About us." "Never," William said fiercely. "I could never forget. I love you more than anything in this world, Sophie, more than my company, more than all the money, more than my own life. And I've been a terrible father. But if you'll give me a chance, I want to do better. I want to be there for you the way your mom would have wanted, the way you deserve." Sophie threw her arms around her father's neck, and they held each other and cried together for the first time since the funeral, finally sharing their grief instead of drowning in it separately. And Rachel stepped back quietly, tears streaming down her own face because she knew she was witnessing something sacred, a family finding their way back to each other. After that day, everything changed. William cut his work hours in half, started having breakfast with Sophie every morning, tucking her in every night, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He didn't just drop her at the diner. He stayed, and he talked with Rachel too, learning from her natural wisdom about childhood trauma and emotional needs. And slowly he rebuilt the relationship with his daughter that grief had nearly destroyed. Rachel became not an employee, but a cherished friend to their family. And when she graduated with her degree in child psychology a year later, William funded her first practice with one condition: that she'd always make time for one particular 9-year-old girl who thought she was bad, but was really just broken, and who'd found healing through the simple power of being truly seen. Sophie never became perfect. She still had hard days, still struggled with her mother's absence, still felt big emotions that sometimes overwhelmed her. But she was no longer the child throwing vases and driving away nannies. because she'd finally found what she'd been screaming for all along: connection, understanding, and the knowledge that she was loved, not despite her pain, but through it. On the 2-year anniversary of Grace's death, Sophie, William, and Rachel released balloons at the park together, each balloon carrying a written memory of Grace. And as they watched them float up into the sky, Sophie held her father's hand on one side and Rachel's on the other, and she said something profound for a now 10-year-old girl. "Daddy, I think maybe Mom sent Rachel to us not to replace her, because nobody could, but to remind us that love doesn't end, it just changes shape, and if we're open to it, there are people everywhere willing to help carry our broken pieces until we're strong enough to be whole again." William looked at this waitress who'd shown his daughter more genuine care in a few hours than dozens of trained professionals had in months, who'd asked for nothing and given everything, who'd reminded him what actually mattered. And he whispered, "Thank you, Rachel. You didn't just help Sophie, you saved our family." Rachel smiled through her tears and said, "You saved yourselves. I just showed up and paid attention," which is something every child deserves, and something that costs nothing but means everything. As the last balloon disappeared into the clouds, Sophie leaned against her father, finally at peace, finally knowing she was seen and heard and loved, proving that sometimes the most unthinkable thing isn't grand gestures or expensive solutions, but simply the revolutionary act of one human being choosing to truly see another, especially when that other is a hurting child the world has labeled as impossible. Because no child is impossible, some are just waiting for someone patient enough, kind enough, and brave enough to look past the behavior and see the wounded heart underneath. And when that happens, when love shows up without conditions or agendas, even the most broken things can begin to heal.